The story opens on a cold New York night, the hum of the city's heartbeat beneath the glow of street lamps and cigarette smoke. The camera drifts through the shadows of Little Italy, down alleyways slick with rain as a voice begins to speak, low, deliberate, and steady. Before Lucky Luciano, the Mafia was chaos. After him, it was an empire. This introduction sets the tone, cinematic and psychological. The audience is not simply being told a story about crime. They're being invited into a world where loyalty is currency, betrayal is strategy, and morality blurs in the pursuit of power. The narrative begins with the tension between two Americas, the one that glittered with jazz, speakeasies, and luxury, and the one that starved in tenement alleys, clawing for survival. Into this world walks Charles Lucky Luciano, not yet a legend, not yet a boss, just a kid with sharp eyes and an unshakable belief that power is something you build, not something you're born with. His name would come to define an era, his vision would reorganize crime into a corporate structure, and his ambition would shape the underworld, and the law that tried to stop it, for generations. The introduction briefly flashes forward, the 1930s headlines screaming his name, the courtroom sketches capturing his calm smirk, the FBI's files stamped confidential. Then it cuts back to where it all began. A young immigrant boy stepping off a ship from Sicily, carrying nothing but a change of clothes and a hunger to never be powerless again. The tone is reflective but tense, not heroism, not condemnation but fascination. The voiceover invites viewers to question, what makes a man like Lucky Luciano? Is it the environment that shapes him, a world built on survival, or an inner calling toward control and influence? Throughout this opening, the camera would weave between archival photographs, slow-motion recreations, and the rhythmic pulse of a jazz bassline. We hear snippets of voices, prosecutors, journalists, former associates, overlapping in an almost musical rhythm. He was smart, too smart. He changed everything. He made the Mafia American. The story positions Luciano as more than a gangster. He becomes the embodiment of the American contradiction. A man who built his empire using the same principles that built Wall Street: strategy, efficiency, and ruthless competition. Emotionally, the introduction aims to evoke both awe and discomfort. It presents Luciano as both innovator and manipulator, a product of his time and an architect of its shadows. His rise is framed not as destiny, but as deliberate design. A man who looked at a system of chaos and saw an opportunity for order. The section closes with a cinematic foreshadowing, a slow zoom on Luciano's mugshot, his eyes steady, his half-smile unreadable. The voiceover fades. In a world of kings and killers, Lucky Luciano didn't just survive the game, he rewrote its rules. Then a cut to black. The faint echo of footsteps. The empire is about to begin. Before Lucky Luciano ever dreamed of running New York, the American underworld was a battlefield without borders, a world of chaos, paranoia, and blood. The 1910s and 1920s were decades when power changed hands through violence, not intelligence. The criminal landscape was not a sleek network of organized crime. It was a patchwork of small-time gangs, ethnic enclaves, and desperate men clutching for territory. It was a primitive ecosystem, brutal, inefficient, and governed by superstition rather than structure. New York City was the beating heart of this chaos. From the docks of Brooklyn to the crowded tenements of the Lower East Side, every neighborhood had its own boss, its own gang, and its own rules. The Italians ran their rackets. The Irish controlled the docks. The Jews operated the gambling dens and street hustles. The air itself was thick with the scent of illegal liquor, tobacco, and ambition. Prohibition, meant to purify the nation, had instead become its greatest sin, and its most profitable business. But this underworld was not united. The early Mafia in America was ruled by old-world traditions, imported from Sicily and Calabria. Men like Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano carried the weight of centuries of Sicilian custom. Omerta, the code of silence. Vendetta, the blood feud. To them, power was personal and sacred, something to be defended with bullets and betrayal. The streets of New York became their battlefield, and every speakeasy, every dock, every corner was a piece of territory worth dying for. These early bosses were feudal lords, men who demanded tribute, loyalty, and obedience. Their empires were not built on cooperation but on intimidation. Disputes were settled not in meetings but in alleys, with pistols drawn and promises broken. There were no systems, no hierarchies, no boardrooms, only chaos disguised as honor. This was the world into which a young Luciano would step, and it would shape his vision for what crime could become. The Italian gangs were just one part of the city's tangled web. The Jewish underworld, led by figures like Arnold Rothstein, was evolving faster, sharper, smarter, more business-minded. Rothstein was the man who fixed the 1919 World Series, and he treated crime the way bankers treated finance. His methods would later influence Luciano profoundly. He saw crime as commerce, not chaos, a system that could be organized, expanded, and protected through structure. Rothstein's mentorship planted a seed in Luciano's mind, the idea that intelligence, not tradition, was the true key to power. Meanwhile, America itself was changing. The Roaring Twenties were a paradox: jazz clubs, flappers, and skyscrapers on one side, unemployment and immigrant poverty on the other. The American dream shimmered like a mirage, visible but unreachable for those who came from the slums. For Italian immigrants, survival meant hustling. They were outsiders, scorned by the establishment, forced to build their own systems of power. The Mafia wasn't just crime, it was an alternative society, one that offered protection and opportunity when America's doors were closed. But by the late 1920s, the system was cracking. The old world bosses were losing control of their soldiers, their alliances fraying under greed and pride. Joe Masuria, known as the boss, demanded loyalty through fear. Salvatore Maranzano, his rival from Castellamare del Golfo, believed himself a Roman emperor reborn. Between them, the city became soaked in blood. The Castellamarese War, a war that would define Luciano's destiny, was beginning to brew, though no one yet knew its name. The streets were whispering. Drive-by shootings became nightly symphonies. Cars riddled with bullets were found idling at intersections, their engines still running. Men disappeared without a trace, their bodies later pulled from the Hudson wrapped in chains. Newspapers began to call it the murder storm. But for those inside the underworld, it was just business, an endless struggle for survival and supremacy. It was in this anarchic environment that Luciano observed everything, silently, strategically. He watched how loyalty was bought and broken, how greed undermined power, and how chaos consumed even the strongest men. He saw that the Mafia, for all its rituals, was unsustainable, too fragmented, too emotional. If it were ever to truly thrive, it needed structure. It needed order. It needed a leader who could think like a businessman, not a warlord. Luciano understood something the old dons never did, that the modern world demanded modernization in everything, even in crime. America was industrializing, corporations were expanding, the government was growing more powerful. If the underworld wanted to survive, it had to evolve. He saw an opportunity where others saw only violence, a chance to rebuild the Mafia from the inside out, to turn gangs into departments, rackets into markets, and criminals into shareholders. The world before Luciano was one of blind violence and outdated codes. His genius would be to turn it into something enduring, a machine that could outlast any one man. But before that transformation could take place, the old order would have to destroy itself. As the 1920s closed, the city stood on the edge of an invisible revolution. The last of the old dons were tightening their grip, unaware that their empires were already dying. In smoky backrooms and secret speakeasies, whispers began to circulate about a new kind of thinker rising through the ranks, a man who spoke of peace, profit, and power through organization. The streets didn't yet know his name. But soon they would. Because in a world without order, the man who could create it would become a king. And that man was Lucky Luciano. Charles Lucky Luciano was born as Salvatore Lucania on November 24, 1897, in the small Sicilian town of Lercara Fritti, a landscape of sun-scorched hills and grinding poverty. His father Antonio worked as a sulfur miner, a dangerous, back-breaking trade that barely kept the family alive. Sicily at the turn of the century was a place where law and loyalty were interchangeable, where respect was often earned through intimidation, and where silence, omerta, was not just tradition but survival. When the Lucania family boarded a ship for America in 1906, they were chasing what every immigrant dreamed of: opportunity. But for young Salvatore, the streets of New York offered a harsher reality. The Lower East Side, where the family settled, was a concrete jungle of immigrants, Italians, Jews, Irish, Poles, all crammed into dark tenements, living one rent payment away from starvation. Children learned early that kindness was a weakness, and that the only real authority was fear. Salvatore quickly adapted. He was small, sharp, and streetwise. He learned English faster than his parents, not from schoolbooks but from street corners. By the age of 10, he was running errands for older boys in the neighborhood, delivering packages that weren't always what they seemed, collecting debts, and watching how the underworld operated. He understood early that power didn't belong to those who followed the rules, but to those who rewrote them. By his teens, Luciano had dropped out of school entirely. The Lower East Side became his classroom, and its lessons were written in bruises, deals, and betrayals. He joined a local gang known as the 5 Points Gang, a notorious training ground for future mob legends. Its leader, Paul Kelly, wasn't a brute, he was a strategist. Kelly taught his young recruits that intelligence and image were as important as muscle. He wore suits, spoke English fluently, and demanded discipline. For Luciano, this was the first model of what a modern gangster could be: refined, strategic, untouchable. Around this time, Luciano met two men who would shape his future forever: Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Lansky was a Jewish kid from Belarus, quiet and brilliant, with the analytical mind of a chess player. Siegel was his opposite: fiery, unpredictable, a born enforcer. Together, the three formed a new kind of brotherhood that transcended ethnicity, something unheard of in a time when Italian and Jewish gangs distrusted each other deeply. Luciano saw in Lansky a kindred spirit, someone who viewed crime not as chaos but as opportunity. By his late teens, Luciano was already earning serious money. He ran protection rackets, controlled dice games, and was involved in minor bootlegging even before Prohibition began. His reputation spread quickly, not just for being fearless but for being unusually pragmatic. He was known for saying, "There's no need to kill a man when you can do business with him." That single philosophy would later become the cornerstone of his empire. But the streets were unforgiving. In 1929, Luciano learned how thin the line between life and death could be. One night, after leaving a nightclub in Manhattan, he was kidnapped by a group of unknown men, beaten, stabbed, and left for dead on the shore near Coney Island. He survived barely. His face was permanently scarred, his eyes slightly drooping, but he wore his wounds like a crown. From that day forward, people started calling him Lucky. He never spoke about who ordered the hit. Some said it was rivals, others believed it was a warning from his own associates, but the experience hardened him. He learned that survival wasn't luck at all, it was calculation. When Prohibition hit in 1920, America turned into a playground for organized crime. Alcohol was illegal, but demand was higher than ever. The black market exploded, and suddenly street gangs were evolving into bootlegging syndicates. Luciano saw the opportunity immediately. He partnered with older mobsters like Joe, the Boss Masuria, supplying liquor to speakeasies and nightclubs across the city. But unlike many of his peers, Luciano didn't just want to make money, he wanted to make structure. He began building connections not just with Italians but with Jewish and Irish bootleggers, seeing diversity as strength. He developed a reputation as the man who could connect worlds, bridging gaps between cultures and turning enemies into partners. This was radical thinking for its time. The Mafia was traditionally closed, insular, distrustful of outsiders. Luciano's alliances with men like Lansky and Arnold Rothstein marked a cultural revolution. The moment crime in America began to look less like a Sicilian secret and more like a multinational corporation. Rothstein in particular became a mentor. The elegant gambler known as the Brain taught Luciano the language of power, how to launder money, manage investments, and buy influence. Rothstein believed that corruption was more efficient than confrontation, that a well-placed bribe could achieve what violence could not. Luciano listened carefully. When Rothstein was murdered in 1928, Luciano didn't just lose an ally, he lost a teacher. But the lesson stuck. By the end of the decade, Luciano was no longer a street hustler. He was a strategist moving in higher circles, a man equally at home in smoky backrooms and Manhattan's most expensive clubs. He wore tailored suits, spoke fluent English, and projected calm authority. To the public, he was a charming young businessman. To those who knew better, he was a rising force in the underworld, a man who saw the Mafia's future before anyone else did. Yet even as he rose, Luciano remained an outsider in the eyes of the old-world bosses. Men like Masuria viewed him with suspicion, too modern, too Americanized, too willing to collaborate with non-Italians. To them, tradition was sacred. To Luciano, tradition was a cage. The tension between those two philosophies would soon erupt into a war that would tear New York's underworld apart. But before that war began, Luciano had already made his first and most important choice: to lead not through fear but through intelligence. He understood the psychology of power, that true control came not from violence but from stability. He once told an associate, "If you can make a man money, he'll never be your enemy." That belief, born in the dirt of Sicily and refined in the alleys of New York, would guide him for the rest of his life. From a poor immigrant boy to a self-made king of the streets, Luciano's early years were not just a prelude, they were a transformation. He had seen both worlds, the desperation of the powerless and the corruption of the powerful. And as he looked out over the glittering skyline of New York, he made a silent promise to himself. He would never be poor again. He would never take orders again. He would not just survive in America, he would own a piece of it. The empire was still a dream, but for lucky Luciano, the streets had already taught him everything he needed to know to build it. By the late 1920s, lucky Luciano had climbed from the gutters of the Lower East Side into the gilded backrooms of Manhattan's criminal elite. He was now working under Joe the Boss Masuria, a man whose grip on New York's Italian underworld was as powerful as it was primitive. To outsiders, Masuria was untouchable, feared by everyone who dared to whisper his name. But to Luciano he represented something else, a relic of a dying world. Masuria embodied the old-school Sicilian mindset. He believed that control came through fear, that violence was the only language of respect, and that loyalty could only exist among pure Sicilians. He distrusted outsiders, rejected alliances with non-Italians and refused to modernize. His operations were chaotic, messy rackets, uncoordinated hits, endless feuds. For a man like Luciano who dreamed of transforming the Mafia into a disciplined enterprise, Masuria's reign was not leadership, it was stagnation. Luciano played the part of the loyal lieutenant. He smiled, obeyed orders and earned for his boss, but behind that calm expression he was already envisioning something bigger. He had learned from Arnold Rothstein that power didn't need to scream, it could whisper. Quiet influence could achieve what bullets never could. And in those years, Luciano began weaving the delicate web that would one day strangle the old order. Under Masuria, Luciano ran a network of profitable bootlegging operations. Prohibition was still roaring and illegal liquor was liquid gold. But unlike other lieutenants, Luciano didn't hoard his profits. He reinvested them, building relationships with corrupt cops, judges and politicians. He understood the true mechanics of crime in America. Power flows through favors. While Masuria focused on enforcing obedience through fear, Luciano was buying loyalty through opportunity. This difference in philosophy was not just business, it was cultural. The old Mafia clung to Sicilian customs, where personal loyalty and bloodlines mattered more than strategy. But Luciano was an American gangster. He believed in efficiency, in organization, and profit. To him, ethnicity was irrelevant if the man could make money and keep his word. He saw in people like Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello the future. Men who could think, negotiate, and build systems. The world was changing fast, and Luciano intended to make sure the Mafia changed with it. Behind closed doors, he began quietly meeting with rival factions, Italians, Jews, and Irishmen alike. These were dangerous conversations, acts that bordered on treason under the Mafia's old rules. But Luciano didn't care. He understood that the endless blood feuds among Italian gangs were killing profits. Everyone was fighting over territory when the real money was in partnership. He told his closest allies, "We're all trying to make $1. Why kill a man who can help you make $2?" These secret meetings were the earliest seeds of what would later become the Commission, the governing body of organized crime. But in the late 1920s such ideas were revolutionary. To most traditional mobsters, even suggesting equality between ethnic groups was blasphemy. Luciano was breaking unwritten laws, not with violence but with ideas. Still, rebellion came at a cost. Masuria began to grow suspicious of his ambitious young lieutenant. He'd heard whispers that Luciano was spending too much time with outsiders, men like Lansky, Siegel, and Dutch Schultz. In the paranoid world of the Mafia, such rumors were death sentences. To survive, Luciano played the part of the devoted soldier even harder. He attended Masuria's dinners, offered him envelopes of cash and swore loyalty. But in private he was preparing for something the old boss could never imagine. A coup not of bullets, but of structure. The defining moment came in 1930, when another powerful Sicilian, Salvatore Maranzano, arrived in New York from Castellamare del Golfo, Sicily. He came with an army of loyal men and a clear ambition: to overthrow Masuria and take control of the Mafia in America. What followed would become one of the bloodiest chapters in underworld history, the Castellamarese War. At first, Luciano was caught between two monsters. Masuria demanded loyalty, Maranzano promised reform. Both wanted total control. But Luciano saw something neither of them did, that this endless cycle of violence could destroy everything they had built. The war was costing lives, money, and reputation. Newspapers were splashing Mafia killings across front pages, and law enforcement pressure was mounting. For every gangster killed, 10 more were arrested. Luciano realized that survival meant evolution. He began to maneuver carefully, presenting himself as neutral while quietly gathering intelligence from both sides. His friendship with Frank Costello and Lansky gave him access to networks beyond the Italian circles: lawyers, politicians, bankers. He started thinking not like a gangster but like a CEO preparing for a corporate takeover. The psychology of this transformation was profound. Luciano had grown up in a world where power meant control through fear. Now, he understood that true power came from creating systems so efficient that they made themselves indispensable. He wasn't interested in being the boss in the traditional sense, a title that required constant bloodshed to maintain. He wanted to build something that could run itself, a criminal democracy where money was the ultimate measure of respect. Still, Masuria wouldn't go quietly. His paranoia deepened, and he began purging his own ranks, killing anyone suspected of betrayal. Luciano watched as men he'd known for years vanished overnight. He knew that his time to act was running out. The longer the war dragged on, the weaker the old guard became, and the stronger his vision looked by comparison. There's a story, half legend, half truth, that one night over a dinner of fine wine and seafood, Luciano listened to Masuria rant about loyalty, blood, and the old ways. Luciano nodded politely, poured him another glass and smiled. In that moment he had already decided that the old world was finished. The rules of Sicily had no place in modern America. Luciano's rebellion wasn't born out of rage or revenge, it was born out of logic. He understood that fear creates obedience, but respect creates stability. He wanted a mafia that could survive the next generation, one that operated like a business, not a battlefield. By the dawn of the 1930s, Luciano stood at a crossroads. On one side was Masuria, aging, paranoid, and clinging to the past. On the other was Maranzano, intelligent, ruthless, but still bound by Sicilian pride. And in the middle was Luciano, young, pragmatic, and patient. He wasn't going to destroy the old mafia with one bullet, he was going to replace it with an idea. In the quiet moments of the night, when the city hummed and the lights of the speakeasies flickered across his window, Luciano knew the future was his for the taking. The only question left was how, and when, to break the final rule. Soon blood would answer that question. But when the smoke cleared, the world would never be the same again. For the first time in history, organized crime was about to become organized. Masuria, increasingly paranoid, began executing his own lieutenants, believing everyone was plotting against him. His leadership was crumbling. Luciano, ever the opportunist, knew this was the moment to act. One evening, Luciano invited Masuria to a private meeting at a Coney Island restaurant, Scarpato's. The arrangement was simple: a casual lunch, some cards, a discussion about ending the war. But beneath the polite conversation, every man at that table knew something was about to change forever. Accounts differ on what exactly happened next, but the legend remains the same. Luciano excused himself from the table, to use the restroom or perhaps to take a phone call. Moments later, 4 gunmen burst into the restaurant: Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Bugsy Siegel, and Joe Adonis. They opened fire. Masuria was found slumped over the table, a playing card still in his hand, his body riddled with bullets. The old boss was dead. With Masuria's assassination on April 15, 1931, the first phase of the Castellamarese War ended. Luciano had just committed the ultimate betrayal, but also the ultimate power move. By killing his own boss, he eliminated the greatest obstacle to his vision. Yet he wasn't celebrating. He knew the war wasn't truly over. Now Maranzano controlled the city. At first, Maranzano presented himself as a reformer. He reorganized the mafia into structured families, each with a boss, underboss, and capo regime. He even created a commission-like council, but one where he alone sat at the top, declaring himself capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. For a man who preached unity, it was a revealing declaration of absolute power. Luciano saw it for what it was: a new version of the same problem. Maranzano had simply replaced Masuria's chaos with tyranny. He spoke of Roman discipline, likening himself to Julius Caesar, and expected other bosses to bow to his authority. He began purging anyone he deemed disloyal or too ambitious, especially younger men like Luciano, whom he viewed as dangerous Americanizers corrupting the true mafia. Luciano smiled in public, nodded at Maranzano's speeches, and congratulated him on victory. But inside he was already planning the next move. He knew Maranzano's days were numbered. "There can't be a boss of all bosses," he told Costello privately. "Not in America. The only boss is business." Over the summer of 1931, tensions escalated. Maranzano's paranoia deepened. He hired bodyguards, ordered surveillance on Luciano, and even secretly contacted a hitman to eliminate him. What he didn't realize was that Luciano had already struck first. Through Meyer Lansky he contracted a team of Jewish assassins, men who could blend in without attracting attention from the Italian guards. They were professionals from Murder Incorporated, the Brooklyn-based enforcement group that would later become infamous. On September 10, 1931, the war came to its final, blood-soaked conclusion. That morning, Luciano received word that Maranzano was planning to have him killed that very day. Calm and composed he made a phone call, a single decisive command. Within hours, a group of men entered Maranzano's office in the Park Central building on 46th Street. They posed as government agents, flashing fake badges and claiming to be conducting a tax investigation. Maranzano's guards, unsuspecting, let them through. Moments later, the men drew their weapons. Maranzano was stabbed and shot multiple times. His empire, and the old Sicilian order, died with him on the office floor. The Castellamarese War was over. In less than 2 years the old Mafia hierarchy had destroyed itself. But out of its ashes rose something entirely new, a criminal organization no longer ruled by bloodlines and vendettas, but by profit and power sharing. For the first time, the Mafia would operate like a corporation with shared leadership and defined structure. Luciano, at only 33 years old, had become the most powerful gangster in America, not by brute force but by vision. He had orchestrated a war, ended it on his terms, and positioned himself as the one man everyone could work with. The final irony was poetic. The young man once viewed as a reckless Americanized outcast had become the architect of modern organized crime. He didn't just win the war, he rewrote the rules of the underworld. As the city settled into an uneasy peace, Luciano reflected on the bloodshed that had brought him here. More than 60 men were dead, dozens more vanished without trace. But to him it had been necessary, evolution by violence. In his mind, the Mafia had been reborn. The streets were quiet again, but beneath the silence, something new was stirring. A system that would run like clockwork, where business replaced war, and where Lucky Luciano would sit not as a tyrant, but as the architect of order. The old world had died in blood. The new one was about to be built in shadow. By 1930 New York City was a battlefield. Beneath the roar of Model T engines and the glamour of jazz clubs, a silent civil war was consuming the underworld, a war that would decide who ruled America's criminal empire. Newspapers called it the Mafia slaughter. Historians would later name it the Castellamarese War. But to the men who fought it, it was something far more personal, a war for survival, honor, and the future of organized crime itself. The combatants were two titans from the old world, Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano. Both were Sicilian, both ruthless, both obsessed with control. Masuria had ruled the New York rackets for years through fear, bribery, and brutality. Maranzano, newly arrived from Castellammare del Golfo, believed he was destined to purify the Mafia, to restore it to its true Sicilian roots. But what neither man understood was that the world around them had already changed, and a younger generation, led by Lucky Luciano, was quietly waiting for its moment. The streets turned red. Every week brought new killings, gunfights outside restaurants, bodies in alleys, cars found riddled with holes. The city's morgues overflowed. Soldiers loyal to Masuria hunted Maranzano's men across borough lines, while Maranzano's Castellamarese assassins struck back with military precision. Entire families were wiped out in retaliatory hits. The violence was so frequent that even ordinary citizens began to fear walking the streets at night. For Luciano the war was madness. Each side claimed to be defending tradition, but all he saw was chaos, business bleeding under the weight of ego. The bootlegging networks that once printed money were paralyzed. Gambling dens were shuttered. Police raids increased as politicians demanded action. The profits that had once flowed like liquor were drying up in pools of blood. Luciano understood something that neither boss could see. War was bad for business. He didn't want to choose sides, he wanted to end the war altogether. But to do that, he needed to survive long enough to outthink both of them. Publicly he remained loyal to Masuria. He attended meetings, passed envelopes, and swore allegiance. Privately he maintained lines of communication with Maranzano's camp, gathering information and quietly positioning himself as the one man both sides trusted, or at least didn't yet suspect. It was a dangerous balancing act, one mistake away from execution. But Luciano was a master of appearances. His calm, unassuming demeanor disarmed even his enemies. During this time, Luciano relied heavily on his closest allies, Frank Costello, the smooth-talking diplomat, Meyer Lansky, the strategist, and Bugsy Siegel, the enforcer. Together they analyzed the war like a business crisis. Lansky urged him to think long-term. "Let them kill each other," he said. "When they're gone you'll be left with everything." That was precisely Luciano's plan. The conflict reached its height in early 1931. Both Masuria and Maranzano had lost hundreds of men. The city was divided into zones of death, each controlled by armed factions who answered to no one. The year was 1931. The streets of New York were finally quiet, but it was a silence that felt strange, almost unnatural. After 2 years of bloodshed, the Castellamarese War was over, and the old order of Sicilian bosses had been wiped from the map. What remained was a vacuum, one that only one man had the vision and the nerve to fill. Charles "Lucky" Luciano had not just survived the war, he had engineered its outcome. The deaths of Masuria and Maranzano had left him standing as the unchallenged power broker of organized crime in America. But unlike those who came before him, Luciano didn't want to rule by fear. He wanted to rule by structure. To him, the Mafia was no longer a family, it was a business. And like any business, it needed rules, organization, and leadership that worked. Luciano looked around at what the war had left behind: dozens of surviving gang leaders, all hungry for power, all suspicious of one another. If he didn't act fast, chaos would return. The bloodshed he had just ended could easily ignite again. But Luciano was thinking bigger than any single gang or city. He envisioned a system that could unite them all, a system that could make crime efficient, predictable, and profitable. His solution was revolutionary: the Commission. It would be a council of bosses, representatives from all the major mafia families across the country, who would meet to discuss policy, settle disputes, and divide territory. There would be no boss of bosses. Every family would govern its own affairs, but the Commission would act as the supreme court of the underworld, enforcing peace through shared interest. It was democracy by gangsters. In theory it sounded idealistic. In practice it was pure genius. Luciano understood that the only way to maintain power was to distribute it carefully. He didn't need to control everyone. He just needed everyone to believe that they had a voice. In the fall of 1931, Luciano gathered the surviving leaders of New York's most powerful factions at a discreet hotel in Midtown Manhattan. Present were names that would soon become legends: Frank Costello, Albert Anastasia, Vito Genovese, Joe Adonis, and Tommy Lucchese from New York, Stefano Megadino from Buffalo, and Chicago's representative, a young, calculating boss named Al Capone, then operating through his lieutenant Frank Nitti. The meeting was historic. For the first time in American Mafia history, the most powerful men in organized crime sat around a table, not to kill each other but to cooperate. Luciano spoke plainly, his voice calm and deliberate. "We've been killing each other for years," he said. "And for what? Territory? Power? Respect? Look around. The cops are richer, the politicians are laughing, and we're burying our own soldiers every week. That's not business, that's stupidity. From now on we make peace our policy. We work together. We divide the country. We share the profits. And if anyone breaks that peace," he paused, letting the silence fill the room, "we handle it together." It was a radical idea, and it worked. The Commission became the backbone of organized crime. New York was divided into 5 families: the Luciano family, later the Genovese family, led by Luciano himself, the central pillar of the system; the Mangano family, later Gambino, headed by Vincent Mangano and enforced by Albert Anastasia; the Gagliano family, later Lucchese, led by Tommy Gagliano and his lieutenant Tommy Lucchese; the Bonanno family, led by Joe Bonanno, representing the old Sicilian faction but aligned with Luciano's vision; the Prophesai family, later Colombo, run by Joe Prophesai, the conservative traditionalist among the modernizers. Each family operated semi-independently but adhered to collective rules. Disputes were brought before the Commission, which acted as a tribunal. Votes were taken, territories respected, and decisions enforced by consensus. For the first time, organized crime in America had a constitution, an invisible government hidden within the nation's bloodstream. But the Commission's reach didn't stop at New York. Luciano's ambition extended nationwide. Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Buffalo, and even Los Angeles were brought into the fold. The Syndicate, as the press would later call it, became the first truly national criminal network, a confederation that managed everything from bootlegging and gambling to labor racketeering and narcotics. The genius of Luciano's design was its efficiency. He turned the Mafia into a machine that could survive any single man's fall. If one boss died, another stepped in. If one racket was raided, another took its place. Power was no longer personal, it was institutional. Luciano's right-hand man, Frank Costello, handled the political connections, ensuring that city officials, judges, and police captains stayed loyal through a steady stream of cash. Meyer Lansky oversaw the financial arm, laundering money through legitimate fronts, hotels, and offshore accounts. Together, they transformed organized crime into an invisible empire that operated like a multinational corporation. Luciano's own leadership style was subtle but absolute. He avoided flashy displays of power, preferring diplomacy to violence. If disputes arose, he offered negotiation first, but he made sure everyone understood that peace had a price. The commission wasn't a council of friends, it was a balance of fear and respect, one Luciano managed with surgical precision. And it wasn't just about profit, it was about image. Luciano began reshaping how the Mafia was perceived. He discouraged unnecessary killings and public shootings that attracted headlines. He wanted the underworld to blend seamlessly with the legitimate world, to operate in suits and boardrooms instead of alleys. This was the dawn of organized crime in every sense. Still, beneath the polished surface, tensions simmered. Not everyone accepted the new order. Traditionalists grumbled that Luciano had betrayed Sicilian values, that he had turned the sacred honor society into a business cartel. But even they couldn't deny the results. Money was flowing, the police pressure was easing, and the days of constant war were gone. The commission met regularly, often under the guise of social gatherings or business conventions. Every major decision, from murder authorizations to market expansion, passed through its approval. Luciano's genius lay in making others feel that they shared power while maintaining quiet control behind the scenes. He was no longer just a boss, he was the architect of a system, the CEO of organized crime. By 1932, the transformation was complete. The Mafia was no longer an immigrant's desperate hustle. It was an empire, one woven into the fabric of American life. Politicians took bribes from it, bankers invested its money, and the public romanticized its glamour in films and newspapers. Luciano's creation would outlive him, shaping criminal history for generations. The five families became the foundation of the American Mafia, a power structure so resilient that it would survive wars, arrests, and decades of government crackdowns. And at the center of it all sat one man, calm, confident, untouchable. Lucky Luciano had done what no one before him had even dared to imagine. He had turned murderers into businessmen, gangsters into executives, and anarchy into order. But as the camera would slowly fade out from that first commission meeting, the voiceover would whisper a warning, a reminder of the paradox that defined Luciano's empire. When you build a system on fear and loyalty, peace only lasts as long as everyone agrees who's in charge. Luciano had unified the underworld. But in doing so, he had also created something far greater, and far more dangerous, than himself. He had created a machine that would never die. With the commission established, Lucky Luciano stood atop the criminal world. But unlike his predecessors, his empire wasn't built on chaos or superstition. It was built on structure, numbers, and cold calculation. He was no longer a street gangster. He was a businessman, operating a shadow corporation that spanned coast to coast. To the public he was invisible. To the underworld he was the law. Luciano's philosophy was simple. Crime wasn't about violence, it was about efficiency. "We're not thugs," he would tell his men. "We're businessmen who happen to break the law." And in many ways that statement defined his genius. He understood that violence drew heat, but business brought longevity. The key was to make money quietly, systematically, and with the discipline of an executive board. The foundation of this new criminal economy was diversification. Luciano knew that bootlegging, the lifeblood of the Prohibition era, was nearing its end. The government was preparing to repeal the ban on alcohol, and when that happened, countless mob fortunes would dry up overnight. So he prepared early. Instead of clinging to liquor, he expanded into every profitable corner of the underworld. Gambling was first. From illegal dice games in back rooms to high-end casinos in Havana and Saratoga Springs, Luciano saw gambling as a perpetual gold mine. It didn't depend on government policy, it depended on human nature. People would always take risks and he would always be there to collect a percentage. With Lansky's help, he began investing in racetracks, floating casinos, and even legitimate betting operations. Then came the unions. Luciano and his allies infiltrated labor organizations, especially the longshoremen's unions and truckers' guilds. Whoever controlled the docks controlled the city's imports, and that meant leverage, over business, over politics, over everything. Kickbacks flowed from shipping companies eager to avoid strikes, and Luciano made sure his men took a cut from every deal that passed through the harbor. Prostitution was next, and perhaps his most controversial venture. Luciano didn't invent organized prostitution, but he industrialized it. He transformed it from a chaotic network of street pimps into a regulated business. Brothels operated under supervision, madams paid dues, and every working girl was tracked for profit. It was, in Luciano's eyes, just another enterprise, one that, according to prosecutors later, brought in millions a year. But the real brilliance wasn't in any single racket, it was in how he linked them together. Every operation fed into another. Trucks that moved liquor also transported slot machines. Dockside unions ensured smooth shipments for gambling equipment. Politicians on the payroll kept the police distracted with petty arrests while the real money flowed through unseen channels. Luciano had built not just a network but a system. And at the center of that system was control. He didn't micromanage every detail, that was for lieutenants like Costello, Genovese, and Lansky. Instead, Luciano functioned like a CEO, delegating power while maintaining oversight through loyalty and financial discipline. Every week, money from rackets across the city was funneled into his central pool. Each family paid tribute, and each received their cut of larger operations. It was profit sharing, the mob's version of corporate equity. To outsiders, the transformation was astonishing. Within a few short years, the once bloody Mafia had become a smooth-running organization. Turf wars had nearly vanished. Arrests were rare. Police corruption was rampant, and local politicians looked the other way. Luciano's reach extended far beyond the underworld. It reached into City Hall, the courts, and even legitimate businesses that quietly laundered Mafia profits. His most trusted political connection was Frank Costello. Known as the Prime Minister, Costello was the face of legitimacy, a polished, cigar-smoking diplomat who moved comfortably in elite circles. He managed the mob's relationships with city officials, controlled gambling in Louisiana and Florida, and ensured the machine kept running smoothly. If Luciano was the empire's architect, Costello was its statesman. Meanwhile, Meyer Lansky played the role of financier. A mathematical prodigy with a mind for risk, Lansky helped expand Luciano's empire into international territory. Together, they forged deals in Cuba, where casinos operated with government blessing, and in Las Vegas, where gambling was about to become America's next gold rush. Lansky's vision of a global network aligned perfectly with Luciano's dream. Crime is a business, not a blood feud. But power always breeds envy, and even in Luciano's new order, cracks began to form. Some lieutenants, like Vito Genovese, resented taking orders from anyone, even from Lucky himself. Genovese was brutal, ambitious, and old school, a man who still believed in fear over diplomacy. He tolerated Luciano's leadership, but in his heart, he dreamed of replacing him. Luciano understood this, and he accepted it. In his mind, ambition was a useful tool. As long as everyone made money, no one would risk disrupting the peace. Greed keeps men loyal, he once told Lansky. But he also knew that loyalty built on profit could crumble the moment the balance shifted. By the mid-1930s, Luciano's empire had reached its zenith. The newspapers called him the underworld's most mysterious man. The police knew his name but could never touch him. He was too smart, too cautious. He left no paper trails, made no public threats, and rarely appeared in front of cameras. To the world, he was just another successful businessman with a taste for fine suits and quiet dinners at the Waldorf. Behind that calm exterior, however, was a relentless strategist. He constantly reviewed reports from his capos, monitored law enforcement activity, and adjusted operations like a corporate executive managing risk portfolios. If a racket attracted too much attention, he shut it down. If an area showed profit potential, he expanded. Every decision was guided by logic, not emotion. And yet, for all his precision, Luciano's empire depended on something intangible, the illusion of control. The five families cooperated because they feared the chaos of the past. Politicians cooperated because they feared exposure. Prostitutes, gamblers, union bosses, all paid tribute because they believed the system was untouchable. But that illusion would not last forever. Luciano's biggest mistake wasn't arrogance, it was underestimating the one force he couldn't control: public perception. As his wealth and influence grew, so did whispers of his power. Prosecutors began asking questions. Journalists began digging. And the reform-minded politicians of New York, eager to make their mark, started to see the Mafia not as an invisible empire, but as a target that could make a career. For now, though, the empire thrived. Luciano was at his peak. the quiet ruler of a nation within a nation. He dined with judges, bankrolled Hollywood films, and hosted parties where gangsters mingled with celebrities. To many he seemed invincible. But every empire built in shadows eventually meets the light. In the coming years, Luciano would face the one adversary he could neither bribe nor intimidate, a woman who would expose his empire piece by piece and bring him to his knees. Her name was Eunice Carter, and she was about to make Lucky Luciano's empire bleed. The era of business was about to collide with the era of justice, and for the first time, the boss of bosses would find himself trapped by the very system he had created. By the late 1930s, Lucky Luciano's empire had become the stuff of legend, a silent force that touched every corner of New York life. From the glittering nightlife of Times Square to the dimly lit docks of the Hudson, everything seemed to flow through his invisible network. Politicians bowed, police officers looked away, and money moved like blood through the veins of the city. To the underworld he was untouchable. But to the growing reform movement in New York, he was public enemy number one, the ghost that haunted every backroom deal, every unsolved killing, every whispered rumor of corruption. The truth was, Luciano had gotten too good at hiding. The city's politicians knew he existed, but they couldn't prove it. His hands never touched the crimes. He had no offices, no signed papers, no public presence. He ruled through intermediaries, through loyalty and fear. His genius was distance, the ability to control everything while appearing to control nothing. But that very invisibility became his weakness because it made him a myth, and myths, in politics, are meant to be slain. Enter Thomas E. Dewey. Dewey was young, ambitious, and incorruptible, a rising star in New York's legal system determined to clean up the city's reputation. He had watched as the Mafia grew fat off bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution, while ordinary citizens lived under its shadow. But Dewey wasn't just looking for a few arrests, he wanted a symbol. He needed one spectacular conviction that would define his career, and he set his sights on the man everyone whispered about but no one could touch, Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Dewey's plan was daring. Instead of going after Luciano's gambling operations or labor rackets, which were difficult to trace, he decided to target the one business where the Mafia left traces everywhere: prostitution. The logic was simple. Unlike gambling or narcotics, prostitution required a massive network of communication, movement, and control. Pimps, madams, and call girls all operated in visible circles. They rented apartments, exchanged money, kept lists, and spoke to dozens of people every day. If Luciano really controlled the city's vice trade, Dewey reasoned, he would eventually appear somewhere in that web. But Dewey's investigation would have gone nowhere without one woman, Eunice Carter. Carter was a brilliant African-American attorney, one of the first women of color to hold a position in the Manhattan District Attorney's office. Sharp, fearless, and methodical, she began interviewing arrested prostitutes and noticed a pattern. No matter where the arrests occurred, Harlem, Brooklyn, the Bronx, the girls all paid tribute to the same network of men. The routes, the prices, even the rules were the same. Someone was coordinating it all from the top. Carter's insight turned a routine vice investigation into a conspiracy case that would shake the foundations of organized crime. She built a map of connections linking dozens of madams and pimps back to one organization, and at the top, through intermediaries like Joe the Bug and Jimmy Blue Eyes, she found whispers of the name Lucky Luciano. Dewey was skeptical at first. Luciano was too careful, too detached. But Carter's evidence was compelling. Dozens of witnesses described payments made for protection, threats delivered from higher up, and orders that came through men connected directly to Luciano's lieutenants. Slowly, the invisible empire began to take shape on paper, not through guns or rackets but through ledgers, phone calls, and whispered exchanges in tenement rooms. Meanwhile, Luciano was living like royalty. His days began in a penthouse suite at the Waldorf Astoria, where he conducted meetings dressed in silk pajamas, attended by his lieutenants. He was calm, charming, even courteous, a man who looked more like a movie producer than a criminal kingpin. He had built the perfect illusion: respectability. He believed the system he created made him untouchable. But as Dewey's investigation deepened, cracks began to appear. One by one, the dominoes started to fall. Dewey's team raided brothels across the city, arresting hundreds of prostitutes and madams. Most were terrified but under pressure, and with the promise of leniency, they began to talk. They described regular payments, secret codes, and visits from well-dressed men who delivered envelopes of cash for the boss. Dewey's prosecutors tracked those payments, tracing them upward through layers of intermediaries, all the way to Luciano's closest associates. By 1936, the net was closing. Luciano's trusted men, like his enforcer Tommy Lucchese and bodyguard Vito Genovese, tried to shield him, but the evidence was piling up. The newspapers had caught wind of Dewey's campaign, and headlines screamed about New York's vice king. For the first time, the public saw Luciano not as a mysterious businessman, but as a criminal mastermind exploiting women for profit. The narrative shifted, and once the public believed it, there was no going back. Luciano, sensing the storm, tried to flee. He boarded a train to Hot Springs, Arkansas, intending to lay low until things cooled off. But Dewey's reach was long. The federal authorities tracked him down and arrested him in a local hotel. The news exploded across the nation. Lucky Luciano captured. The man who had outsmarted the entire justice system had finally been caught, not by violence but by paperwork, perseverance, and one brilliant investigator who saw what others missed. Back in New York, Dewey prepared the case of his career. The trial would be more than a prosecution. It would be a spectacle, a statement to every gangster in America that the age of invincibility was over. He charged Luciano with compulsory prostitution, orchestrating a citywide sex trafficking ring. It was an unprecedented move. No major mob boss had ever faced such a charge. But Dewey knew the optics mattered more than the details. Luciano's defense team argued that the charges were absurd. They claimed he was a businessman, not a pimp, a gambler, not a trafficker. They pointed out that none of the witnesses had ever met him personally, that his name appeared nowhere in records. But Dewey's team, armed with months of testimony and patterns of behavior, painted a different picture. One of a man so powerful that he never needed to touch the crime to profit from it. The media devoured every detail. Luciano became a headline, a symbol, a myth unraveling in real time. The same public that once admired his charisma now saw him as the face of organized vice. His confidence remained unshaken, at least outwardly. In private he was furious, pacing in his cell, cursing his lieutenants for letting things spiral. The empire he had built on loyalty was collapsing under pressure. Men he had trusted for years were turning away, afraid of the spotlight. For Dewey it was personal triumph. For Luciano it was the beginning of the end. But even in defeat, Luciano played the long game. He instructed his allies to keep the machine running, to ensure that the commission survived even if he went down. "They can lock me up," he said calmly, "but they can't jail an idea." As the verdict drew near, Dewey's courtroom turned into a theater of fate, the reformer against the kingpin, order against the empire of shadows. When the sentence finally came, 30 to 50 years in state prison, the courtroom erupted. Reporters called it the end of an era. But they were wrong. Because even behind bars, Lucky Luciano wasn't finished. The empire still obeyed him, the commission still met, and the money still flowed. Dewey had won the battle, but the war, the hidden war, had only changed location. From his prison cell, Lucky Luciano would soon find a new kind of power, one that no courtroom could take away. And in time he would remind the world that even when a king falls, the crown can still cast a shadow. The spring of 1936 brought the spectacle New York had been waiting for, the trial of Charles Lucky Luciano, the man whom the press had dubbed the Lord of the Underworld. For years he had been a name whispered in alleys and boardrooms, feared by gangsters and admired by politicians for his cunning and control. But now he was just another defendant, seated in a courtroom under bright lights, flanked by guards, his fate in the hands of 12 ordinary citizens. The courthouse buzzed with energy. Reporters packed the benches, photographers jostled for position, and the public lined up outside just for a glimpse of the most powerful gangster in America brought low. The tabloids framed it like a modern morality play. Luciano, king of vice, faces justice. Inside the courtroom the air was thick with anticipation, tension, and something else, fascination. Luciano didn't look like a man on trial for his empire. Dressed immaculately in tailored suits, his hair slicked back, he carried himself with quiet confidence. To the jurors he seemed more like a movie star than a criminal. Even in chains his presence commanded respect. He greeted the guards politely, flashed smiles to the reporters, and occasionally whispered to his lawyers with calm detachment. It was all performance, a psychological game. Luciano knew that power wasn't only about money or muscle. It was about perception. Across the room sat his adversary Thomas E. Dewey, the relentless prosecutor whose campaign against organized crime had turned him into a national hero. Dewey, stern and methodical, saw this case as more than a legal battle. It was a moral crusade. If he could bring down Lucky Luciano, he would prove that no man, however powerful, could stand above the law. The charge, compulsory prostitution, was unprecedented. Never before had a mob boss been accused of running a citywide prostitution syndicate. Dewey's argument was that Luciano had orchestrated a vast network of brothels through layers of intermediaries, collecting profits and enforcing discipline across New York's vice industry. It was a bold claim and risky. There was no paper trail, no direct evidence linking Luciano to the crimes. Everything depended on witnesses, madams, prostitutes, and low-level operatives whose credibility would be torn apart by Luciano's defense. Still, Dewey had something stronger than documents. He had momentum. The public was behind him, the newspapers printed daily updates, and each new witness brought the case closer to a narrative the jurors could believe. Luciano, the unseen hand controlling a city of sin. Over the course of several weeks, Dewey presented testimony from 68 witnesses, many of them women who had once worked in Luciano's prostitution network. They described a world of strict organization and silent control, payments made on time, rules enforced with precision, and protection provided by men who invoked Lucky's name. Some had never seen Luciano personally, but all believed their money ultimately reached him. One woman, a madam named Cokie Flo Brown, became the centerpiece of the prosecution. Her testimony was explosive, filled with vivid descriptions of the syndicate's hierarchy and the whispered reverence with which Luciano's name was spoken in the underworld. "You didn't cross Lucky," she told the court. "He didn't have to threaten you, everyone just knew what would happen." Luciano's defense team, led by attorney George Morton Levy, countered with precision. They argued that Dewey's case was built on hearsay, on the words of criminals and addicts seeking leniency. Levy's tone was smooth, almost mocking. "Not one of these witnesses," he said, "ever saw my client commit a crime. Not one can place him in a single illegal act. This entire case," he continued, turning dramatically toward Dewey, "is built on imagination, on fear of a man who doesn't exist outside of rumor." The courtroom audience erupted, split between admiration and outrage. Dewey responded calmly, "Mr. Levy is right about one thing, Lucky Luciano never dirties his hands. That's what makes him dangerous. He builds walls of fear and money so thick that he doesn't need to pull the trigger himself." Every day felt like a chess match. Luciano's calm demeanor clashed with Dewey's relentless logic. The press covered their exchanges like prize fights, describing each cross-examination as a round in a heavyweight battle between intellect and influence. Despite the glamour, the trial was grueling. Witness after witness took the stand, recounting the same patterns: payments, codes, punishments. Slowly, the cumulative weight of testimony began to tip the scales. Even without direct evidence, the picture was forming. A man who ruled through invisible threads, who made vice into an industry. Luciano grew restless. He complained to his lawyers about snitches and cheap girls selling stories. At night, back in his cell, he paced and smoked, muttering that Dewey was using him as a stepping stone to power. He wasn't wrong, Dewey's political ambitions were no secret. But Luciano underestimated how much the world outside had changed. The age of silent power was fading. The public wanted accountability, and Dewey gave it to them. In his closing argument, Dewey's words cut like a blade. "This case is not about a few brothels or a few dollars. It is about whether crime can become so organized, so hidden, that it believes itself untouchable. It is about whether one man can control a city through fear and still claim innocence because he never personally pulled the strings. Mr. Luciano built a machine, one that corrupted our police, exploited our women, and sold our city's soul. It's time that machine be dismantled." Luciano's lawyer responded with fire. "This is not justice," he thundered. "This is theater. A young prosecutor wants headlines, and so he invents a villain. You will convict my client not because he's guilty, but because you want him to be the man Dewey says he is. You can't convict a legend." But in the jury room, the tide had already turned. After 9 hours of deliberation, they returned with a verdict: guilty on 62 counts. The courtroom erupted. Reporters ran for telephones, spectators gasped, and Dewey allowed himself a small, rare smile. Luciano's expression barely changed. He simply straightened his tie, glanced toward Dewey, and nodded, a quiet acknowledgement of defeat, or perhaps respect for a worthy opponent. The sentence was severe: 30 to 50 years in state prison. It was the harshest punishment ever handed to a mafia leader in American history. Dewey had his victory. Luciano had his cage. As he was led away, flashes from camera bulbs lit his face, the face that had ruled an empire without ever showing emotion. For the first time, the untouchable man had been touched. But even in defeat, there was something haunting about his calm. As the guards escorted him through the corridor, he whispered to one of his lawyers, "They think it's over. But the world don't stop because I'm in a cell. And in a way he was right. Behind the headlines and the celebrations, his network remained intact. The commission continued to operate, the money continued to flow, and his loyal lieutenants, Costello, Genovese and Lansky, ensured that business went on as usual. Dewey had caged the man, but he hadn't dismantled the empire. Lucky Luciano was behind bars, but his shadow still ruled the streets. And from within that prison cell, the man who had once rewritten the rules of the Mafia was about to discover a new kind of power, one that didn't need freedom to survive. The age of the gangster on trial had ended. The age of the gangster who ruled from a prison cell was about to begin. When the iron doors of Clinton Correctional Facility slammed shut behind him in 1936, the world believed that Charles "Lucky" Luciano's reign was finally over. To the newspapers he was finished, a relic of a violent past, locked away where he could no longer poison the city's veins. But those who truly understood power knew better. For men like Luciano, walls and guards didn't end control, they only changed its form. From the outside, Clinton Prison, tucked away in the frozen reaches of upstate New York, was a world apart from the glittering Manhattan skyline where Luciano had once ruled. Its stone walls loomed like medieval fortresses, its corridors echoing with the clank of iron and the low murmur of men who had lost everything. The cold seeped into the bones. The guards were harsh, the routines brutal. But for Luciano this was simply a new office, a colder, quieter one. Within weeks, the tone of the prison began to shift. The same charisma that once commanded the five families began to work its magic even here. Luciano wasn't loud, didn't throw his weight around, and didn't try to escape. Instead he observed. He studied the guards, the schedules, the hierarchy among inmates, and slowly he began to apply the same organizational genius that had built his empire. He started small. Cigarettes, favors, food, the currency of confinement. He arranged quiet trades between inmates, settled disputes, ensured protection for those who earned his trust. Before long, the guards noticed that fights had stopped breaking out in the cell block Luciano occupied. The men there followed an unspoken order, his order. For the prisoners, Luciano became a kind of legend, a symbol of control within chaos. He offered advice to younger inmates, mediated between rival groups, and, in return, they offered loyalty. To the guards he was polite and disciplined, the model prisoner. He never caused trouble, and when asked to perform labor or attend roll calls, he complied with quiet dignity. But behind that composure was a man still running an empire by proxy. Luciano's lieutenants on the outside, particularly Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, and Meyer Lansky, maintained constant communication through coded letters and discreet visits. Prison regulations forbade him from conducting business, but there was little the authorities could do to stop information from flowing. His messages were hidden in legal correspondence, smuggled in through bribed guards, or passed by visiting relatives, who were, in reality, mob emissaries. Through this network, Luciano continued to guide the commission. Every major decision, territory disputes, leadership changes, financial investments, passed through him. His words still carried weight. In the underworld, it was said that Lucky runs New York from Dannemora, a testament to how deep his influence reached. Even behind bars, his empire adapted and evolved. Frank Costello took charge of political and gambling operations, ensuring the syndicate maintained its legitimacy through connections in City Hall. Meyer Lansky expanded into Cuba and the Caribbean, planting the seeds for the Mafia's international ventures. And Genovese, ever the ambitious schemer, positioned himself as Luciano's successor, though his loyalty would later prove dangerously thin. In the cold isolation of prison, Luciano found time to reflect. He had always seen himself as a pragmatist, not a moralist. Yet now, stripped of luxury and freedom, he began to understand the cost of what he'd built. His empire had outlasted him, but so had his enemies. "The world don't stop because you're in a cage," he once told a fellow inmate. "You just learn to make the cage work for you." He spent hours reading newspapers, studying the outside world's reaction to his downfall. The Mafia, he realized, had become more than an organization. It was now part of American culture, part of the city's rhythm. He had turned the underworld into a system that could run without him, a self-sustaining machine of power and profit. But there was also a sadness in that realization. He had built something so efficient that it no longer needed its architect. Still, Luciano refused to fade quietly. In 1942, an unexpected event would thrust him back into relevance, and change his life once again. That year, World War II raged across the globe, and America faced a new kind of threat. German submarines prowling the Atlantic, sinking supply ships within sight of New York Harbor. The government grew desperate for intelligence and control over the docks, which were plagued by sabotage fears. The Navy needed help, and, incredibly, they turned to the most unlikely ally, the Mafia. Through intermediaries, naval intelligence reached out to underworld figures, seeking cooperation in securing the waterfront. Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky made the connection. Their message to the government was simple: you want the docks safe? Talk to Lucky. And so, in one of the most extraordinary episodes of American criminal history, the U.S. government quietly partnered with the imprisoned Luciano. From behind bars, he provided assurances that sabotage would end, ordered his men to cooperate with military authorities, and offered information on Axis sympathizers operating through Sicilian ports. The program, later dubbed Operation Underworld, was kept secret for decades, but it marked a bizarre alliance. The U.S. Navy and the American Mafia united by necessity. For Luciano, it was an opportunity. Not only did it restore his relevance, but it also planted the seed for his eventual freedom. He had done what no mob boss had ever done before: turned patriotism into leverage. When the war ended in 1945, the political winds began to shift. Dewey, now the governor of New York, found himself under pressure from those who viewed Luciano's cooperation as invaluable to national security. Luciano's lawyers petitioned for clemency, arguing that his assistance to the Navy had saved American lives and protected vital wartime shipping. Dewey was no friend of Luciano's, but he was a pragmatist. In early 1946, he made a controversial decision. Lucky Luciano's sentence was commuted, on the condition that he be deported immediately to his native Italy. On the morning of February 9, 1946, after nearly a decade behind bars, Luciano walked out of prison. He was thinner, older, but still sharp-eyed, the kind of man who could wear defeat like a well-tailored suit. As he stepped into the cold air, he reportedly smiled and said quietly, "I may be going home, but I ain't finished." He wasn't lying. Behind bars, Luciano had not only survived, he had evolved. He had learned that power was not about location, it was about connection. He had ruled from a distance before, and he would do it again. The world outside had changed, but his mind remained as dangerous as ever. He was no longer the street kid from the Lower East Side or the kingpin of New York's 5 families. He was something new, a man who had conquered both the law and time itself. The newspapers called his deportation a victory for justice. But those who understood the Mafia's true nature whispered a different truth. Lucky Luciano hadn't been defeated. He had simply been relocated. And from the shores of Italy, the world was about to feel his influence once more, not through violence but through quiet manipulation, diplomacy, and the enduring power of the system he had built from the shadows. The ship that carried Lucky Luciano away from America in 1946 sliced through the Atlantic like a blade through history. As the skyline of New York faded into a thin gray line on the horizon, he stood on deck, silent, wrapped in an overcoat, his hat tilted low. The sea wind whipped at his face, but his eyes never moved from that receding city, the city he had built, ruled, and lost. It wasn't nostalgia that filled him, it was calculation. For a man like Luciano, exile wasn't the end. It was a repositioning. He arrived in Naples to a hero's welcome, or at least that's what the local press called it. Reporters swarmed the docks, drawn by the legend of the man deported as America's most powerful gangster. To the Italian authorities, he was a liability. To the people, he was myth incarnate, the poor Sicilian boy who had conquered New York. Crowds called his name and photographers captured his faint, knowing smile. But beneath that calm exterior, Luciano felt displaced. Italy was not his world anymore. He had left as a boy and he returned as an outsider. The old Mafia, the Cosa Nostra of Sicily, operated with a different rhythm, bound by centuries of rural codes and traditions. Luciano represented something new: efficiency, commerce, and modern crime as enterprise. He respected their ways but did not belong to them. Still, exile had not stripped him of influence. From the moment he stepped foot in Naples, letters and telegrams began to arrive. His men, Costello, Lansky, and Genovese, kept him informed. Every message was coded, every word chosen carefully. Luciano's exile, they knew, was not retirement, it was remote command. He quickly found allies in Italy's black markets and port cities, where American soldiers and locals traded everything from cigarettes to contraband liquor. Through contacts on both sides of the Atlantic, Luciano helped establish a smuggling network that moved goods, and later narcotics, from Europe to the United States. His name opened doors, his reputation closed mouths. Even without setting foot on American soil, he remained a silent shareholder in the underworld. By 1947, Luciano had made a new base of operations in Naples. He lived modestly on paper, in an apartment overlooking the bay, where he entertained few guests. But behind closed doors, his residence became a hub of quiet meetings. Men from across Italy, France, and Cuba visited under various pretenses. It was there that Luciano began shaping what would become the globalization of organized crime. He understood that America's Mafia, Italy's Cosa Nostra, and emerging criminal networks in Latin America could function like a multinational corporation, each division autonomous yet bound by mutual profit. He didn't need to rule through fear anymore. He ruled through structure. In 1947 he received a message that rekindled his ambitions. Meyer Lansky wanted to meet in Havana, Cuba. The idea was bold, to transform Havana into a paradise for gambling, drugs, and money laundering free from jurisdiction. Luciano's eyes lit up. Havana was the new frontier, close to the U.S., but beyond its laws. Arranging his travel was no easy feat officially. Luciano was banned from entering the Americas. But corruption as always had its price. With forged papers and quiet support from friends in high places, he made the journey under a false name. When his ship docked in Havana in late 1946, it was as if the old king had returned from the dead. The reunion between Luciano and Lansky was both emotional and strategic. The two men met at the luxurious Hotel Nacional, overlooking the Caribbean, surrounded by palm trees and jazz. There, Lansky introduced Luciano to a new generation of underworld investors, financiers, casino owners, and drug traffickers. Over cigars and whiskey they discussed the future. The world was changing. America was entering a new era of prosperity, and with it came appetite for pleasure, escape, and vice. Luciano envisioned Havana as the underworld's Wall Street, a meeting ground where gangsters could operate like businessmen. And at the center of it all, quietly watching, would be him. In December 1946, a historic meeting took place, the Havana Conference, attended by mob bosses from across the United States. It was the first major gathering of the American Mafia since the formation of the Commission in the 1930s, and it symbolized Luciano's continued influence. Despite being exiled, he was still the chairman. At the conference, Luciano delivered what would become his last great speech to his men. He reminded them of the importance of unity, discipline, and modernization. "We built something that can't be destroyed," he said. "If one man falls, another takes his place. We're not just gangsters anymore. We're businessmen. And business never dies." But his return to prominence didn't go unnoticed. U.S. intelligence, alarmed by reports of his presence in Havana, pressured Cuban authorities. Within months, the U.S. government demanded his deportation. Under heavy American pressure, Cuba capitulated. In early 1947, Luciano was arrested and placed on a ship back to Italy. His second exile was quieter, more final. In Naples, he resumed his routines: morning walks along the harbor, espresso at the same cafe, an evening card game with old friends. Yet the fire that had once driven him began to dim. He was aging, watched constantly by Italian and American intelligence, his freedom limited to the borders of a country he no longer recognized as home. By the 1950s, the Mafia's center of gravity had shifted again. The heroin trade that Luciano helped organize grew beyond his control, expanding through Marseille's French connection. The American families he had once united were now at odds, and men like Genovese sought to claim the throne for themselves. Luciano's dream of a disciplined, businesslike mafia was dissolving into greed and paranoia. Still, even in semi-retirement, his name carried weight. Younger gangsters sought his blessing, politicians sought his silence, and writers sought his legend. To them, he was the man who built the system. To Luciano himself, he was simply a man who had lived too long inside it. He once told an associate, "You live long enough, you see your own ideas turn into somebody else's mistakes." There was melancholy in those words, not regret exactly, but recognition that no empire, legitimate or criminal, stays pure forever. On January 26, 1962, Luciano arrived at Naples airport to meet a film producer interested in making a movie about his life. Ironically, the meeting was meant to secure his legacy, to tell his story on his terms. But moments after greeting the producer, Luciano collapsed. His heart, the one constant engine of his empire, gave out. He died instantly at 64 years old, not in a hail of bullets, but on the smooth concrete of an airport tarmac. Around him, reporters and police gathered, whispering, "It's him, it's Lucky." Later, his body was transported back to America, the land that had made and destroyed him. Thousands lined the streets as his casket passed through Queens. In death, he was finally allowed to return to the city he had never truly left. For some, he was a criminal mastermind. For others, a visionary. But for all, he was the architect of a new kind of power, one that didn't depend on thrones or crowns but on networks, influence, and silence. Exile hadn't ended Lucky Luciano's story. It had completed it. Because in leaving America he had proven his greatest lesson. True power doesn't live in one place, it lives in every system that survives you. After decades of ruling from the shadows, Charles Lucky Luciano was forced to watch his empire from across the ocean. In 1946 he was deported to Italy, a land that felt more foreign than the America he had conquered. The King of New York now walked the quiet streets of Naples, surrounded not by soldiers or silk-suited allies, but by silence. He had everything: money, influence, reputation, yet nothing that mattered. The underworld he built had moved on. The commission no longer needed its architect. The new generation of mobsters, Carlo Gambino, Vito Genovese, had adapted his system but erased his name. Luciano had become a relic of his own design. Still, he tried to remain relevant. In Havana, he briefly sought to re-establish his influence, meeting with old allies and dreaming of a return. But America shut its doors to him for good. The U.S. government, once his silent partner during wartime, now branded him a national threat. The man who helped defend the docks during World War II was exiled as if he'd betrayed the nation itself. In his final years, Luciano lived quietly in Naples, smoking, reminiscing, haunted by the machine he had built. The visitors who came to see him found not a ruthless kingpin, but an aging man reflecting on a lifetime of control and consequence. In 1962 he collapsed from a heart attack at the airport, moments after greeting an Italian film producer who wanted to tell his story. The irony was cinematic. The man who orchestrated America's criminal empire dying as the cameras were about to roll. Lucky Luciano's final act wasn't one of violence or power, it was silence. The empire endured, but the man behind it was finally gone. Lucky Luciano's legacy is written not in marble or law books, but in the invisible architecture of power. He turned the chaos of gang wars into a corporate model, the Commission, a system that outlived every man who sat at its table. Before Luciano, the Mafia was feudal. After him, it was modern. He replaced blind loyalty with strategy, superstition with structure, and blood vendettas with boardroom politics. His empire became the blueprint for every organized network that followed, from crime syndicates to multinational corporations. Yet Luciano's life carries a haunting paradox. He wanted respect more than money and power more than peace. In chasing both, he became a prisoner of his own invention. Even in exile, his influence rippled across oceans, shaping Havana, Italy, and the very soul of American crime. By the time he died, his name had become legend. To some, he was a visionary, to others, a ruthless manipulator. But everyone agreed on one truth: Lucky Luciano changed the rules. He didn't just play the game, he redesigned it. His greatest creation was not the Mafia itself, but the idea that crime could be managed like business, and business could operate like crime. That idea still echoes today. Modern power still bears Luciano's fingerprints. From corporate hierarchies to political machines, his philosophy, structure, secrecy, control, survives. He showed the world that systems, once built, could outlive morality. The Mafia may have faded, but the mindset remains. Every deal made in the dark, every quiet exchange of influence, follows his logic. Luciano turned crime into an institution, and institutions into organized power. His true brilliance was not violence, but vision. He saw the future before it arrived. A world where respect replaced fear and control hid behind legitimacy. But power, as he learned, always consumes its maker. The boy from Sicily who dreamed of dignity built an empire that left him alone. His final lesson was simple: power endures but peace does not. Today his story feels less like history and more like prophecy. In every hidden deal and unspoken alliance, Lucky Luciano's ghost still moves, quietly, efficiently, unseen. He didn't just change the underworld. He changed how the world works,